Welcome to the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center for today's Climate Explorations event. Today's talk is part of a series of programs that began last spring. We are pleased to partner with Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory to broadcast this event live. There are currently a little under 200 people on the call online, and also make it available on demand following the program. There's a calendar of additional programs, one of which we had on the screen earlier. If you were watching and logged in earlier on the broadcast, you'll see that next week we'll have a presenter in Franklin Park Conservatory. If you are online, if you're in person here, we'll take questions at the end. You're free to ask those. If you're online, there's a chat box. You can go ahead and type questions in, and what we'll do is distill those down into questions to ask at the end and try to field both questions from the live audience and also those folks online. Dr. Ellen Peters is Professor of Psychology and Director of the Decision Science Collaborative at The Ohio State University. She conducts basic and applied research in judgment and decision-making. She's worked extensively with the U.S. National Cancer Institute and Food and Drug Administration to advance science of human decision-making as it applies to health and health policy. She is current president of the Society for Judgment and Decision-Making and is former chair of FDA's Risk Communication Advisory Committee. She is also a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, the Researchers Foundation, and National Institutes of Health. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you guys for inviting me. The talk I'm going to give today came about in part through an undergraduate course I teach in judgment and decision making, but it sort of morphed when Bob Inglis came to visit campus. I invited him to visit campus about a year or so ago, I think, and then got to meet Ellen and Lonnie Thompson, and the lecture morphed a little bit from there, and I spoke in Ellen's class, and then here I am today. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you a bit. What I'm going to be talking about are some ideas around why we don't believe in science and what the field of decision psychology, and it's really more broad than that, it's decision psychology and social psychology, what psychology has to say about why we might not believe science all the time. So what we're going to talk about are first four themes from decision psychology. About how we judge risks and make decisions. And that'll be a pretty short section. We're going to spend most of the time on beliefs about risks, how we seem to construct our beliefs, and persist in our beliefs over time. We're going to talk a bit about the idea of confirmation biases and why beliefs don't change when we're faced with new information. And then we'll go into a climate change example where I introduced the idea that in a lot of ways, belief persistence may be quite rational within climate change. We're also going to look at a gun control example. And in the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how might we be able to work with beliefs? How can we help people change their beliefs to be more in line with the data? We'll talk about that towards the end. So first of all, let's start off with these four themes in the psychology of judgment and decision making. And these are just four basic themes that I teach in my undergraduate class and also my graduate courses. And it's just the idea that, and this is something that we all know, but we don't always think about. It's the idea that we are bombarded every day with so many decisions and so much information that we're not always sure what to do with it. So if you think about just today, you've made some very not all that important decisions. What breakfast cereal to eat, or what to have for breakfast, whether to come to this talk or not, whether to show up on time or not. Some of us might have made more important decisions. These don't happen very often, though, but things like, am I going to change my career? Am I going to get married or divorced? But every day we're faced with just this huge volume of decisions as well as information. However, we have limited resources. So human beings, all of us, are capable of great intellect, but we're what's called boundedly rational. We have limited attention and have limited working memory. We're what's called boundedly rational. And because of that bounded rationality, we tend to take mental shortcuts, judgments, and decisions because we can't cope with all of the information all the often. And so we do what Herbert Simon calls status thinking. So when we're faced with a decision, sometimes what we want to do is we want to make the absolute best decision. We want to maximize. We want to choose whatever is the absolute best decision. That's not what happens most of the time. Most of the time we do what's called status thinking. Make a very efficient decision. Frequently good enough, but it's not necessarily the best decision. That can be adaptive, and it can also be maladaptive. Sometimes we make a mistake, we satisfice, and suddenly it turned out that situation was one we really should have maximized, really should have gone for the best option. So when you satisfice, you mistake. of bounded rationality, use of heuristics and bias, is we use these heuristics to judge sides. There's a lot of different examples of heuristics here, just very simple ones. But one thing you might do is conclude that a person is closed or defensive because they have their arms crossed. You might decide to eat at restaurant B rather than A, not because you know anything about eating in restaurants, but because one of them has more cars. You use that popularity as a heuristic to figure out which restaurant. This is one of my favorite ones from childhood. We went out to Florida for vacation every year over Christmas, and my brothers and I, we all decided not to ever swim again in the ocean because of the three saws. And you guys hear the music? We do kind of heuristics every day, and it's just a way of making our lives simpler because we are facing information and too many options. And all of those themes lead to the last theme, and this is in the end going to be what we talk about mostly today. It's the idea that we frequently don't know our own true values for an object or a situation. We end up constructing what our values are, we end up constructing what our preferences and our beliefs are based on situations. And then a lot of what we're going to talk about today is that we construct things like based on who we are as decision makers. We'll talk about that a bit today. So ideally, when we think and decide, we're objective. We see information, we see facts, we understand those facts, work towards understanding those facts, and ultimately bring those facts into whatever our judgment is. The problem is that's not how the human mind works. Instead, we are influenced, as I mentioned before, by this huge number of systematic heuristics and biases. This is part of what we study in my field of thinking. There are a variety of different irrelevant cues that influence us, even outside of our awareness sometimes. We're influenced by our emotions. We're influenced by our mood states, just how happy or sad we are at the moment. And what we're going to talk about mostly today is this last one. It's this idea that we seek out, interpret, weigh information according to what we do ahead of time. So we seek out, interpret, and weigh information according to whatever our a priori beliefs were. In other words, we construct our beliefs, and those beliefs are constructed in part through what we wanted to believe in the beginning. That's what we're going to talk about a bit. Our beliefs actually end up coloring our perceptions of reality, and it's not just lay people; it's also experts. This is a study was done back in 2001, where 57 wine experts were asked to take taste test, glasses of wine. So glasses of wine was the red wine, the one was the white wine. Or so they were told. Really, the wines are actually the same white wine, both of them. Except that one of them had been tinted very carefully to look as if it was a red wine. And they did a good job, apparently, because the experts described the red wine in language typically used to describe red wine. One expert praised Danny Head. Another one enjoyed its crushed red fruit, even though they were both white wines. And in fact, not a single wine expert actually noticed that both wines were white wines. They thought one was white and red. And the perception of the taste changed just based on the color of the wine. And this is part of that notion that I started off with about belief persistence. This idea that we have a tendency to maintain our beliefs without sufficient regard to evidence against them or the lack of evidence in their favor. So if we think it's a red wine, taste the standiness. Taste those red fruit flavors. There are a lot of examples of belief persistence. In the 5-second rule, when you drop food on the floor, it actually is not safe. That rule is not true. A lot of people believe that getting a base tan will protect you against sunburn. Also not true. And so, but even though people get burned after having a base tan, they nonetheless, getting that base tan somehow helps protect them. Another one, and this one is maybe more, it's sort of a nicer example in a lot of ways. If you're studying a difficult new topic. Sometimes when we go into a difficult new topic, there's a period of time where it feels impossible. It seems like I'm never going to be able to wrap my head around these ideas and I'm just not going to be able to do it. And yet somehow we perceive the idea that even though it's a really difficult topic, I've done it before, and I can do this again. So belief persistence is really rational. It can actually inspire us to do more, even when we're not quite sure we can do it. But they can also be irrational. Persistence can make someone make worse decisions. So imagine you're pursuing someone who is clearly not interested, and yet you persist in the belief maybe she will be. There's a word for that, it's stalker. Another belief persistence, a person with clinical anxiety might continue with a debilitating death and make decisions as a result of that. So there are a lot of ways where belief persistence is irrational, but it's a gray area. What do you guys think of Thomas Edison? He apparently once said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." It ultimately succeeds. So in the end, the outcome is great, but what about the process? Is it rational to try 10,000 times and fail and fail and fail again? So it is a gray area whether belief persistence is rational or irrational. But why do we persist in our beliefs? It is the case that we do, at least sometimes. And there are actually two processes, selective perception of information and selective exposure to information, that lead to these confirmation biases, that lead us to confirm what we believed ahead of time. And what I wanted to do now is sort of go through what selective perception and what selective exposure is, and just give you a couple of examples. So the general idea of selective perception is that we see what we want to see and believe what we want to believe. Lord Lepper and Ross were the original researchers ahead of time that half of them favored capital punishment, half of them opposed it. And then what they did is they had everybody read the same information. Everybody read studies, but everyone read both. One of the studies confirmed beliefs in favor of capital punishment, and one of them confirmed those beliefs. So everybody got the same data. And so what should happen from a rational standpoint is people start off like this. They're given new data, they should come together, but they should realize, okay, there are some people who are opposed, there are some people in favor, who are in favor, well, maybe there are some people who are opposed. They should come together. But the ideas of selective perception end up coming in. And what ended up happening in this study is that people ended up saying that the report that agreed with their own a priori attitude was a better report. Where the other report, well, it's a lot more flaws, started thinking of that. Wasn't as good didn't present as good evidence. And so for the average attitude before, remember half the people opposed capital punishment, half favored capital punishment. Afterwards, the attitudes actually polarized. Those people who had been in favor of capital punishment before became even more in favor of capital punishment. Those who opposed before, opposed even more afterwards. So presenting the exact same information caused them to go for support. They selectively persist information. You can also selectively expose yourself to information, of course. You can search for only for what you want to see. And we tend to search for the things that we want to see. So have an a priori, we tend to seek out information that confirms it, and to avoid information that disconfirms our a priori. And so one example, this one's a little bit older. For people who voted for Nixon in 1972, they were completely uninterested in finding out the details of Nixon's lives. But if they voted for McGovern instead, back in 1972, they were super interested in understanding more about what happened. People sought out information that confirmed their a priori beliefs. In another example, this is another election example. People were given the option of ordering brochures that were either about the candidate that they preferred or the candidate that they opposed. And they were actually given examples of components of an opponent's brochure as well as their own brochure. And the brochures both had strong arguments and both had weak arguments. And it turns out that if the brochures both had strong arguments, and again, they read these examples, people were much more likely to order the brochures that had to do with their own candidate. And they're much less likely to order the brochures of the other candidates, as if they were seeking out things that buttressed their own position and didn't want to get information that might work against their own a priori position. The opposite happens if there are weak arguments presented in those examples that they saw. They don't want to hear about weak arguments about their own candidate, but they would love to hear weak arguments about the other side. Because get weak arguments about the other side, in some senses it further undermines that other side position. We selectively expose ourselves as well. It turns out that beliefs are surprisingly stable. And it seems to be because we're often exposed to challenges to those beliefs. This idea of confirmation bias, that selective perception of information, selective exposure to information, lead us to confirm our hypotheses and beliefs rather than testing against them with information that might disconfirm. What we ended up taking a look at in climate change was this idea that new preexisting hypotheses and beliefs end up influencing how much risk climate change. And so we actually looked at risk perceptions. This is the Dan Kahan at Yale University. We looked at risk perceptions in two different environmental domains. For climate change as well as nuclear power. And my priority was that experts in those domains believe that the public doesn't perceive enough risk when it comes to some domains like climate change, but they perceive too much risk at other times in other domains like nuclear power. And in fact, the experts tend to think that the public is irrational. I'm going to use PIT for this idea of the public irrationality. And this public irrationality has sort of three parts of the story. First, that the American public, and other publics too perhaps, but we're going to focus on America, is scientifically illiterate. The public does not know about science. They're what we call innumerate. They're not very good at math, so they don't understand complex numbers, for example. That's the first part of the story. The second part is that that scientific illiteracy and numeracy combined with bounded rationality. Remember, we don't have unlimited resources. We have bounded rationality. That combination leads us to use a lot of processing. It leads us to lead back on other information to make our decisions rather than looking at the data at hand. And that's in part because we're scientifically illiterate and we're innumerate, and so therefore we don't understand the data anyway. Story behind this public irrational. And the kinds of heuristics that have to do with non-numeric information. Things like our fears within a domain, our political meanings, we're going to talk a bit about today. And what we decided was we wanted to test public irrationality within power, and then I'll also show you the data for, within climate change, and I'll also show you the data within nuclear power. What we did was fairly simple. We have a nationally representative sample from Knowledge Network. We actually collected this data in February of 2010. So we asked them a fairly simple question. How much risk do you believe climate change poses to health, safety, or prosperity? And we had them answer on a 0 to 10 scale. We actually standardized the risk perceptions. Risk perceptions are on the y-axis here. So these are people at the bottom of the y-axis are people with lower risk perceptions, and at the top have higher risk perceptions when it comes to climate change. I'll tell you about the x-axis in a minute. In fact, I'm going to right now. I'm going to tell you about the PIT prediction. So the PIT prediction, that's that public irrationality thesis prediction. The prediction that comes out is that innumeracy and scientific literacy should lead to bounded rationality in climate change domains. And what that means is that for people who don't understand numbers and science very well, those who are low in numeracy and science literacy, they should be the ones who don't perceive very much risk from climate change. But for those of us who are really scientifically literate and we're really numerate, we should be more like the experts because we know more. And so we should understand the facts better. That's the prediction. I'm just showing you the prediction again here. Exact same question, same axis. Here's the actual data. So it turns out that people who are more scientifically literate and more numerate actually perceive a little less risk from climate change than those people who are less good at science. It's a tiny correlation. It's like minus 0.09. Really, the main point here is not that it's a negative correlation, but how different it is from the prediction that comes out of the public irrationality thesis. But we can still go on. Maybe we can resurrect the public irrationality thesis, because we do know, for example, that risk perceptions in environmental domains like climate change tend to rely and kind of lean back on political leanings and cultural cognitions. And so we know, for example, that people who are more hierarchical and more individualistic tend to be pretty skeptical of environmental concepts, and they tend to perceive less risk. For people who are more communitarian and more egalitarian, they tend to be much more concerned in environmental domains, and so they should perceive more risk from climate change, for example. And so then we can take a look. So what I'm showing you right now is I'm showing you just the original data of the actual data on numeracy and science literacy, because I want to show you the difference when it comes to cultural cognitions. Because cultural cognitions make a much bigger difference. People who are more egalitarian, communitarian, these are people who are more left-leaning, they perceive much more risk of climate change than do people who are more hierarchical and individual. prediction again, because there's actually a prediction here as well. Because remember, the idea is that cultural cognitions might be used as a heuristic substitute. But if they're being used as a heuristic substitute, it must be being used by people who don't understand the science and math as much. So it should be the case that that big whopping line that had to do with cultural cognitions and their relationship to risk perceptions, that should matter more for people who are lower in numeracy and lower in scientific literacy, because they know less. The people who know more, they should come together on data. And so the tip. So for people who are egalitarian and communitarian, so these are people who are more left-leaning, it turns out that as their numeracy and scientific literacy grow, they do in fact perceive more risk from climate change. So it almost looks like it's in the right direction until you look at this. And here what you can say is that among those people who are more hierarchical and individualistic, they're more right-leaning, they diverge further in the other direction if they're more scientifically literate than if they're less. There's actually less polarization among those people who are low in numeracy and scientific literacy than there is among those people who are high in numeracy and scientific literacy. Polarization in risk perceptions actually increase. That political polarization actually increases as we get more knowledgeable about the math and science that underlies these issues. It's a little depressing. We see similar polarization effects for both climate change. This is just the same data that I'm showing you here for climate change as we do in nuclear power. You get greater polarization with greater scientific literacy and greater numeracy. Same effects. So why is this? I mean, it's a little depressing and it's a little sad in some ways. So why do we do that? And it's because we think it might be rational in some ways. So when we think about these broad societal issues that are so important to us, we think that the goal is to learn the facts and allow them to influence our beliefs. There might be a different goal, though, for individual people. Those individual people may want to remain part of their groups, thank you very much. I want to stay part of my, let's say, conservative, Republican, right-leaning group. And if I say something that goes against that, they might reject me. And I have a very strong need to belong. And if I have a strong need to belong and I say something that goes against my group, I'm suddenly not part of the tribe. And that can be painful. So because of these strong goals to belong, belief persistence may actually be rational at the individual level for the individual person. And those with more skills, by the way, may be better at meeting their own goals, with that goal being, I want to belong. Even though society is worse off, because we can't come together on the facts. But at least we should be able to agree on the answer to a math problem. We should be able to agree that 2 plus 2 equals 4. We should also be able to agree that 12 plus 12 equals 24. It's just math. We should be able to agree on that. So we decided to look. Because it is possible that selective perception matters even when it comes to objective facts and doing math. That's what we're interested in our next study. So this next study is not yet publicized, not yet published, although we put it up on the web. What we had people do, and don't worry about reading the detail here, I just want to show you sort of what the setup looks like. We had people do math in a skin cream experiment. So all this little text up in here is just simply explaining a background story about medical researchers who developed a new skin cream, and then they tested it out among patients, and they tested it out in one group of patients, and they didn't test it out in the other group of patients, and then they looked to see whether the patient's skin rash got better or it got worse. And that's what this little table is here. And I'm going to show you that little table a little bit bigger now. So in the skin cream experiment, what happened was they tested some patients who did use the skin cream and some who did not. And then they just tracked whether the rash got better or the rash got worse. And we simply asked people, what result does the study support? Does it support, one, people who use the skin cream were more likely to get better than those who didn't use the skin cream? Or two, people who use the skin cream were more likely to get worse than those who didn't. The math isn't particularly easy. I can help you out a little bit if you'd like. You actually have to use all 4 cells, and that's the critical problem. People don't use all 4 cells. But it turns out that if you actually do the math, 74.8% of those patients who used the new skin cream got better. And 83.6%, a little bit higher, of those patients who didn't use the new skin cream got better. And so the right answer is actually that people who use the skin cream were more likely to get worse than those people who didn't use the skin cream. People aren't very good at this. People who are bad at math are even worse at this. Oh, and I forgot one part. This is an experiment. I'm a psychologist. We always do experiments. We randomly assign people to experimental conditions. For half the people who got the skin cream problem, they got the numbers that I showed you. And this is rash got better, and the other column is rash got worse. But the other half of the subjects got the same numbers. It's the same math problem, but we switched the column headings. So now the column on the left is the rash got worse instead, and rash got better is on the right. And all that does is it changes what the right answer is. So for this group of people who got that particular table, the skin cream made it worse, the rash increased. For the other group, the skin cream made it better, and the rash decreased. Okay, it's because we just want to be able to take a look at both of those. And these are the data. So this, for the skin cream problem, this is the percent of participants on the y-axis who answered correctly. And it goes from 0% up to 100%. And I am showing you two lines, because one of the lines, the correct answer was the rash decreases, and the other line, the correct answer is that the rash increases. And what you can see is that the lines go up as people are higher in numeric ability. So someone who answered 7, 8, or 9 correct, they're much more likely to get those responses correct than someone who got almost nothing correct on that numeracy scale that we gave them. That kind of makes sense. It's a math problem. People who are better at math are a little better at solving it. But I only told you about half my subjects. The other half of my subjects, I had them go through a gun ban experiment. I still had them do math. I still gave them a background story. The background story here was that a city government is trying to decide whether to enact a gun control law or not. And they have data from cities that either did ban carrying concealed handguns in public or did not ban carrying concealed handguns in public. And then in those cities, crime either decreased or it increased. Let me show you this table a little bit bigger. Oh, wait, spoiler alert. It is the same math problem as the skin cream problem. So we know what we should find here. In this particular case, again, remember I'm varying by experimental condition. For half my people, the way that table is set up, the correct answer is that crime decreases. For the other half of the people, crime increases. Who wants crime to decrease if gun control laws are enacted? What do you think in the back? Yeah, but aren't there some people who want to believe that? What type of people want to believe that enacting gun control laws will decrease crime? Pro-gun people. They're often more conservative people. People who, if gun control, did I say that the right way? I think I said it the opposite way, sorry. So among, if enacting a gun control law decreases crime, someone who's more liberal wants to believe that. I did say it the opposite, didn't I? Sorry about that. Among those people who are more conservative, they would prefer to believe, it's not what the data say necessarily, sometimes it is, but they would prefer to believe that enacting those gun control laws will actually increase crime. So we all probably have a preference for what the right answer is. But half of you got this as the right answer, and the other half of you got that as the right answer. Okay, let me show you the skin cream problem again, because I want to kind of give you comparisons between these two problems. You might remember from the skin cream problem, as people become more numerate, they're much more likely to answer the problem correctly. What about in gun control? It's kind of there. It's similar. What you see is that there is sort of a sloping upwards so that people are a little bit more likely to get it correct in both of those lines as numeracy increases, but the effect is a little wonky. It's not as clear there. And so then we want to take a look at tearing that apart based on political leanings. So first let's show the skin cream problem. What I have still, this is the correct interpretation of the data from 0% to 100%. This is the numeracy score here. So this is the same data that I showed you before on the skin cream problem. The only thing I've done is that I've broken out the liberal Democrats into blue and the conservative Republicans into red. And what you can see is it kind of doesn't matter. Like whether you're Republican or Democratic, it kind of doesn't matter on whether you get this thing right. What matters is numeric ability, because it's a math problem. But gun control is different. It turns out that political leanings mattered for correct interpretation of the data when it came to a politically divisive domain. Let's walk through this carefully. Remember, what we said was that people who are liberal, they would prefer to see that enacting gun control laws decreased crime. And what you can see is that among liberal Democrats, when the actual answer was that crime decreased with gun control, you can see that more numeracy made a big difference. But we have another group of these liberal Democrats. That's this dotted blue line here. This dotted blue line, which you might notice does not vary by numeracy very much, those are the people who are liberal, but enacting gun control laws increased crime in the problem. It's as if when the right answer doesn't agree with your a priori beliefs, it cuts off your math ability. You're not more able to get the problem correct. Generally the exact same pattern is shown in the conservative Republicans. They would prefer to believe that crime increases when you enact gun control laws. And in fact, with this red line here, among those people who are more numerate, and that's the right answer, they're more likely to get it correct. That's what they wanted to see. But if the answer is not what they wanted to see, then you can see that numeracy does not make that much of a difference. They didn't want to see the answer, and it's as if their math abilities were turned off in some senses. This is just another way of looking at the same data. These are partisan differences in the correct interpretation of the data. The line down the middle here is when there is no difference in the percent correct between Republicans and Democrats. If it goes to this side over here, that means that more Democrats got it correct, and over here, more Republicans got it correct. And what you can see is there's no partisan difference when you're looking at the skin cream problem. What ends up happening, though, is when you get down into the gun control problem, if crime is decreasing, if that's the correct answer in the problem, the people who are more liberal Democrat are much more likely to get it correct than the people who are more Republican. The opposite happens if crime increases is the correct answer. The people who are in red over there at the bottom, the people who are more Republican and right-leaning, they're much more likely to get it correct than the people who are more liberal and democratic. There are these fairly large partisan differences. In fact, the average polarization among people who are less numerate is about 25%. So it is the case that even among the less numerate, they are less likely to get it correct if the correct answer doesn't agree with what they want to believe. But among the highly numerate, those people who are better at math, that's you and I, by the way, the average polarization is actually 46%. It's almost double the polarization in the people who are highly numerate than among the less numerate. And this is part of why we don't believe science. Part of why we don't believe science sometimes is because some of us are not very good with numbers, and we're not very good with science. That is absolutely the case. We don't understand it all the time. It is also the case that because we're boundedly rational, we take kind of shortcuts when we're trying to perceive risks, when we're trying to make some decision about what to do. We're going to use some of these heuristics. And that's part of why we don't believe science. Science is effortful. But part of it has something to do with what came above, but it has more to do with people who are highly numerate and highly scientific. It has to do with confirmation drop biases that are driven by selective exposure and that are driven by selective perception of information. This is a picture of a guy named Leon Festinger. He's a very famous social psychologist, and he once said, "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree, and he turns away. Show him facts or figures, and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, and he fails to see your point." This is the idea of confirmation biases, selective perception of information and selective exposure to information. And people who have more ability seem to show it more in some of these politically divisive domains. So that getting it right does depend on the correct answer, but it also depends on whether the correct answer agrees with what you wanted to see in the first place, and especially if you're more numerate. That doesn't mean that it's hopeless. I always hate leaving people with "it's hopeless," because I always find the science absolutely fascinating when it comes to motivated cognition, but I also want to try to be able to do something about it. And it's not the case, I like cartoons and talks, it is not the case that if you have your favorite data that I want you to lick it or sit on it so that no one else is going to use it. There are much better recommendations about what to do, but it is the case that how you present things matters. And that's what I wanted to go into at the end of the talk here. Because there are a lot of evidence-based communication strategies. We were commissioned by the Institute of Medicine recently to take a look at some of these evidence-based themes in communication that can help people make better sense of health information in particular, is what they were interested in. But these are themes that are based on basic psychological principles that should make a difference across domains, so long as you know a little bit about the domain that you're working in so that you can make some adjustments. But some of these don't, and I am going to show you a couple of examples in climate change. One of the evidence-based themes is that you should be providing the numbers. Even though people are innumerate, even though they're not very good with numbers, numbers educate. You should be providing the numbers rather than not providing them. But there are some caveats on that, because you do want to reduce cognitive effort too, and they kind of go against each other in some ways. But what it means is you have to make some careful choices about, do you really have to present all of those options? Do you really have to present all of that information? Can you pick out what's most critical that you really think that people should know, and leave behind the stuff that they might want to know, and put it someplace else that they can go look for, embed it, in a deeper web page or something like that. And there are actually a variety of different ways that you can reduce cognitive effort, and I'm happy to share this paper if anyone's interested. In climate change, as well as many other scientific domains, I also think that we need to provide evaluative meaning. What do the numbers mean? How good or bad is this number in the context of this decision that I'm trying to make? Because while you guys as experts might really understand what these parts per million mean and the fact that it went over some particular boundary, not everybody really understands that. Not everybody really understands how bad is that it went over 400 parts per million. I'm not sure if I'm getting the units correct even. But there's this idea that while information might be familiar to you as communicators, it may not be familiar to the people who are trying to hear it. And it might not be familiar in terms of the language, but it also might not be familiar in terms of the evaluative meaning. How good or bad is this for me in the decision that I'm making at the moment? So that provision of evaluative meaning, again, can be done in a variety of ways, and we can talk about that if you'd like. Sometimes you do have to provide a lot of information, but maybe some of it is more important than others, and there are techniques you can use to draw attention to some information, if it's the most important information there, even though you have to have some of this other stuff that I personally would vote for you to boot off of the page. But sometimes you have to have it there. So these are sort of 4 evidence-based communication strategies with a bunch of different little methods that fall underneath each one. And careful choices of how that information is presented will increase comprehension of the information, and it will increase use of that information. But it is the case that sometimes motivated information processing occurs nonetheless. I don't know, for those of you in the back, if you can't see it, it's a picture of a dog with a pair of glasses. I did the math. We cannot afford the cat. Motivated information processing does occur. In climate change beliefs, the evidence says that you guys all know this, 97% of climate scientists think that human-caused climate change is happening. But at least according to Nicholas Kristof in 2014, only 44% of Americans believe that humans are causing climate change, versus 77% who believe that aliens have visited Earth. So we have some issues here. So what do you do when beliefs may be motivated? So from the psychology literature, there are best ways to change or give up beliefs. They are not easy. You should be asking, and this is the one that's really not easy, asking others to critique their own judgment. You should do it too, though. Assume the logical opposite of your beliefs, or ask this other person to assume the logical opposite of their beliefs, and look at the data again. Do the data still fit when you step into the shoes of somebody else, when you step into the shoes of that opposite point of view? That's one of the ways that people can give up beliefs. They pretend as if they're another person and take a fresh look at the data. As scientists, we should all be doing this. To give up a belief, or to ask someone else to give up a belief, you can't merely tell them it's false. It doesn't work. What does work sometimes is you can replace it with a plausible alternative belief or hypothesis. But that plausibility, it has to be plausible to the other person, not just to the person doing the communicating. So it has to be a plausible alternative belief or hypothesis to the person that you're communicating with. But it is also the case that information presentation can make a difference, we think, in climate change. So we just had a paper come out, I think it came out today actually, in PLOS 1. I was working with Ed Maybach and Tony Leiserowitz, and this is terrible, I've forgotten Meyer's first name, but she's actually at Ohio State. She's terrific. Teresa, thank you. Teresa Myers, for those of you who know her. She's absolutely terrific. And what we did is we actually took some studies that we used to understand psychological principles in information presentation, but that we used in the medical domain, that had been used in the medical domain, and we ported them over to the climate change domain to see if those same psychological principles held true. And so the first one we took was this idea that presenting numbers versus not should educate. I'm a strong believer in this, by the way. We should be presenting the numbers. And it turns out, and I'll show you the results, but this is just sort of a foreshadowing. It turns out that by presenting the numbers versus not increases the proportion of people who believe that the majority of climate scientists think that climate change is human-caused. What we did is we showed people a fake newspaper page, essentially, and embedded somewhere in that newspaper page was an ad. For the control condition, that ad was just a cell phone ad. There was nothing about climate change in it. For the other four conditions, we actually embedded an ad that was from AAAS, from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, about climate change and about how many climate scientists agree that it's human-caused. For some of the people, we just told them that it was an overwhelming majority of scientists. This is non-numeric information. We just gave them those verbal words, an overwhelming majority. The other three conditions of people, the other groups, were told that either more than 9 out of 10 scientists agree, climate scientists agree, 97% agree, or 97.5% agree. And then we simply asked people, the news story page disappeared, so they can't look at the information and tell us what it was. They have to remember it. And then on the next page, the next screen, it was done on computer, we simply asked people, what proportion of climate scientists believe that it's human-caused? We looked at our answers. And what you can see in the control condition and in the non-numeric condition, about 62, 63%, there are these scientific agreement estimates of about 62 or 63%. But if you present people with the numbers on the prior screen, they actually do remember some of the information, sort of. You get increases. So if you tell them, if the message was more than 9 out of 10 scientists agree, on average, people estimate that about 68% of climate scientists agree. So you do get something bigger. But if you give them more information, more precise information, 97%, 97.5%, it increases quite a bit from there to 77 and 78% of this estimated scientific agreement. So presenting the numbers actually does help. It helps people to better understand what's really going on out there. We also looked at another information presentation. This actually came from a breast cancer study that a friend of mine at the University of Michigan had done. What she had done was within breast cancer, she asked women to estimate their likelihood of breast cancer for half the people, and then for the other half the people, she didn't have them estimate. And then she told them what their actual likelihood of breast cancer was. And in breast cancer, you actually expect people to overestimate. That generally tends to be what happens. Women tend to overestimate the likelihood of breast cancer, so that when you give them their actual likelihood, it's much lower, and they're actually quite relieved. And that might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing. They're feeling relieved, but they're also feeling relieved that maybe they won't take further action because their emotions are more positive at that point. What we did is we took that general idea and we ported it over to climate change. Now, in climate change, you expect something a little bit different. If I ask the general public what proportion of climate scientists believe that climate change is human-caused, you would expect people to underestimate. We know that from prior studies. So that when you give them the actual number, maybe that's going to bounce them up even quite a bit more. That's what we wanted to study. And so what we did, we showed people just a message. So here they had a control message. I don't remember what it was. I think it was just something about CO2 emissions are increasing, but there was nothing about the proportion of people who agree about human-caused anything. But the control condition, the control message was climate-related at least. This group of people were not given any kind of, did not themselves provide a prior estimate. And so in this case, they estimated that about 67% scientific agreement existed. The next condition, again, they got just that control message that had to do with CO2 levels, but they actually gave an estimate, got these CO2 levels, and then made another estimate. And what you can see is that maybe the estimates go up a little just because they had made a prior estimate of scientific agreement. So this is the second time that they estimated scientific agreement. Maybe it went up a little bit because it's bigger than the control condition. Not much, though. In the next group, they didn't make a prior estimate, but we did educate them with numbers. We did tell them a numeric message like 97% of climate scientists agree. And here what we find is that education, again, does help. This is similar to the previous study. You get increases in this estimated scientific agreement. And then in the last condition, these are the people where they actually made their estimate. We know that most of them are going to underestimate. And then we give them the actual number. What happens is the estimates go up even more. They're surprised at how high it is, and they increase their estimates. And these increases in the estimated agreement were consistent across political leaning for both of these studies. It didn't really make much of a difference whether someone was more Republican or more Democratic. These simple messages made a difference to people's at least their understanding of the extent to which climate scientists agreed that it was human caused. So what do we conclude from all this? We know that preferences and beliefs in scientific data should be independent, but they're not. They're just not. And we have to understand that. People don't always believe science. It's for a variety of reasons, including sometimes scientific illiteracy and innumeracy. But sometimes it's because we're motivated not to. We're motivated not to see the data. We're motivated to do the math wrong. Even though we're capable of doing the math right, we're motivated. But another set of conclusions has to do with us as communicators, because communication is not an easy task. Communicators, we tend to overestimate what others know. We also tend to overestimate how well we ourselves communicate, and both of those present barriers to getting better at communication in the future. I'm happy to talk about that more. There's a series of studies on just that point there. The public isn't adept at using the complex and often numeric information that's important to good climate decisions. We know that. But evidence-based strategies do exist. There are techniques that we can choose from, and they should be used strategically. We should be picking, we should be deciding what are the goals of this communication. What is it that I want these people to know or to do? Choosing that goal or goals, and then choosing information presentation formats very carefully so that they help you to get closer to your goal, so that you get closer to what it is you want that communication to do. There is a science to good science communication, and we don't always use it, but we should. But we also need more research into how to communicate best in these areas where beliefs are motivated. This is not by any means, we don't know everything in this domain. There actually is a lot of research that's needed. The techniques that I talked about around that research, that report that we did for the Institute of Medicine, those techniques have primarily been tested only in non-politically divisive domains. They've been tested where people really want to understand the information because it's about their health. They've been tested in domains where it's important for them to know the information for them as individuals. And so you don't get this clash between what's good for me as an individual and what's good for society. It's all sort of the same thing in most of the domains where those information presentation techniques have been tested. So we do need more research. Thank you, guys.
We'll alternate with questions from anybody in the room and then those online.
Okay.
Questions?
Yeah.
You were able to analyze the sort of political ideals, but has there been any analysis based on gender or age differences for this?
Oh, good question. So are there any, for those of you online, are there any gender or age differences in the risk perceptions? We have not looked at that. We do know some things in risk perceptions that are related. We know, for example, that females tend to perceive more risks across lots of domains compared to males. But we know more than that at this point, too. We know that what that looks like it really is a white male effect. Particularly more educated, higher income white males tend to perceive less risk than all the other groups. So it seems to have something to do, not so much with gender, which is where it started, but it seems to have to do more with who feels vulnerable to the powers that control and who doesn't feel as vulnerable. It seems to have more to do with that. There's still more research needed there, but that looks like what it is. We didn't actually look at that. We didn't actually look at that in our data. We probably should. And we also did not look at age, and age is a little bit complicated. Age is associated with, as we get older, we tend to get a little less numerate, we're a little bit less flexible as information processors, but we also have this huge lifespan of experience and knowledge and wisdom that we pack on up into our older years. And so I'm not even sure what I would predict there exactly. But it'd be interesting to look at. And if you'd like, I could get you a data set if you want to look.
Online question?
We had a couple of questions about bias on the part of scientists and how that could influence interpretation of the data. It's a little bit of a mix of you can make statistics say anything you want them to say, and then also things like sponsored research, like food safety being sponsored by an agriculture type company. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so if I take the second one first, the idea of having an outside sponsor, the idea of having a sponsor who wants the data to look one way, that does happen. That does not mean that anybody who agrees to getting funding like that is driven by those concerns, because we are very capable of not doing motivated processing as well. But it is those kinds of situations that we end up having those concerns. Is someone more motivated in their look at the data? And so I personally don't tell people don't take money like that, but I would tell somebody, certainly your sponsor is going to have one particular slant on this and something that they want, and maybe you do too, but you need to think about the opposite. You need to think about whatever the opposite view is on this and then look at your data again. That's sort of what I'd have to say about that question. Is there another one? Yeah, in the back.
Sure. I read an article a while ago that explains that as time has progressed, especially in trust and authority has decreased. One, do you think that's true? And also, do you think that lack of trust and authority is being hidden with scientists, or people see information and not trust it?
I think that trust in climate scientists depends a lot on your political viewpoint. Again, we can go back to the studies I talked about earlier around selective perception and exposure, mostly selective perception of data. If I'm someone who is very Republican, very right-leaning, climate scientists in general tend to be more Democratic, left-leaning, and they're saying things that I don't want to hear, I'm going to be more likely to perceive that their reports have more flaws, just like the earlier studies that have been done within selective perception. There's going to be a tendency. That's, again, not to say any one person is doing that, but there is a tendency in that direction. Has the world in general started to trust authority less? I don't know the data on that. Does anybody in the room? Do we tend to trust scientists less today than we did before, in general? I know there is fairly high trust in scientists, but I don't know if there's been some small lag over time. I don't know the data on it. There certainly are data out there.
The whole world seems to know the CO2 level at home. The United States is not accepting that data that's been so crucially accumulated. And I see you mentioned, I think you mentioned big business. You know, I'm sick and tired of the fracking ads and shows that show unadulterated national parks in the background. Fracking is awful, and Citizens United and our democracy seems to be in danger of being bought by big business. That's really, I spent my whole life in clinical laboratory science and using the measure and math and clinical diagnosis, and I'm so sorry that we don't grow up like that. I really enjoyed my background in to do critical thinking. That's what we need to be doing. I'm sorry.
In terms of the critical thinking, I am all for it. I am in favor. More education helps us to think better.
Yeah.
More education helps us to be more scientifically literate, to be more numerate. Could present some problems with what we're seeing here. But it is also the case that if you learn to more critically reason, you should be asking yourself not just, does this support my belief or hypothesis, but does it not as well? And you just always have to be aware of asking both questions. On the big business, I suspect big business, at least some are going to start to shift, because climate change in the end is going to be bad for big business. It's going to be costly. And so we are starting to see some shifts. I remember you showed me a newspaper article not too long ago. I can't remember the name of the group. Do you remember that by chance?
I've forgotten, but there's a group which does prepares legislation for states, which tends to have no longer supporting them because they just support the climate change.
And so that organization is starting to shift their own policies towards their own recommended policies towards climate change. Deniers. Yeah. Yeah, Lonnie.
Are there thresholds in belief persistence for individuals? What is it that makes us? I mean, if you think about climate change,
yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you believe in sea level rise or not. If it's rising, at some stage, it seems that there has to be a threshold.
So I think what your question is, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think what your question is if it's the case that we have this tendency to persist in our beliefs, but data is flying in its face, at what point do we get a tipping point, essentially? Yeah, great question. We don't know. The research that's been done, that I know of at least, the research that's been done has been more about the basic psychological mechanism without trying to identify how do we know when we get to that balance where we just need to shove a little harder to get people to stop persisting in beliefs. So we don't know that sort of level of detail in this theory. But it's really important. And it's also important to know for different types of communication techniques what is more and less effective in the face of belief persistence. And we really don't know that either. We don't know that for climate change, for anti-vaxxers, there's a whole array of these, sometimes politically, but just generally divisive beliefs, where we're still not quite sure what the best thing to do is. We're not quite sure what the best communication techniques are that'll help tip things over. And hopefully we won't have to wait for all the impacts of climate change on big business to happen before the beliefs start to shift. We're hoping it happens a little sooner than that. Yeah.
Other questions online?
There was one request for hearing a little bit more about that overestimation of communication skills that you sort of touched on.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there's sort of two parts to it. One comes from some work by Ray. I shouldn't have even tried saying the name. Ray Nichols or Nicholson. I can look it up if anyone's interested in emailing me. The first part is that we tend to overestimate what other people know, and experts do it in particular. So as experts, we have this huge body of knowledge. We know a lot of facts. We know a lot from our labs. And we know that people know less than us, but we're not really quite sure how much, exactly what they know, what their level of knowledge is. And the way the human mind works is really interesting because what we do, for me to estimate what you know in my field of expertise, I sort of anchor on how much I know, and then I adjust in the right direction, because I know you're not an expert in psychology, so I adjust in the right direction, but I don't adjust enough. And so that in the end, I will vastly overestimate how much you know about psychology, just because I know a lot. It's my field. That's the first part. The second part is more specifically what the person asked. So the second part is we tend to overestimate how well we communicate. And there are these awesome studies that were done by Boaz Kazar at the University of Chicago, where he did things like he would give subjects a really simple sentence. Oh, and I wish I could remember the sentence. It's something like, the woman killed the man with the gun. And there's actually two different interpretations of that sentence. The woman used a gun to kill the guy, or the woman killed the guy who was holding a gun. And what he did in this experiment is he had two people come in. There was the speaker, and the speaker was told the sentence, and the speaker was told both meanings to the sentence to make sure they understood it was ambiguous. And then the speaker was told, we want you to tell the listener this one. Make sure they understand this one and not that one. But they couldn't, and so they could use intonation, they could use, the woman killed the man with a gun. They could do things like that. And then the listener listened, of course, and then indicated, okay, what did the guy mean? Which of these two meanings is what he was trying to communicate to you? The speaker thought they were understood. The listener actually understood 50% of the time. For those of you who know math, that's random chance. We overestimate how well we communicate. I've probably overestimated how well I've communicated this lecture. We look out on a sea of smiling faces. We, hopefully smiling. We do our best to communicate things in as clear a language as we can. But in the end, we often overestimate. Dr. Kazar actually did another study with, I think it was outgoing healthcare providers at a hospital. You know, you get these shift changes at hospitals, and so the outgoing shift has to tell the incoming shift what the major problems are for the people on the ward. And he showed the same problems. The people outgoing thought that they understood. The people coming in sometimes did, not all the time. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a pretty big difference. You know, 100% I thought I was understood. Something far less was actually understood. And so it's not just in these simple sentences that he did in the lab. It also happened in a very real life and important situation. We overestimate how well we communicate. We think we're understood. We're just not all the time. It makes asking questions really important. In health, they have this teach-back technique where a healthcare provider teaches something, and then they ask the patient or the family to teach back, to repeat back what was said, in order to check on that understanding. And that's a fairly effective technique within health. The same kind of thing maybe could be done within climate change if you're one-on-one with somebody. Pretty hard to do if you're communicating to a nation. Then other communication kinds of techniques come hopefully into the forefront.
One more question, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about a variable that I would put in the equation, and that would be my comfort zone. I mean, if I believe in climate change and I don't have to leave my comfort zone, okay, but really, if you believe in climate change, you have to leave your comfort zone. So it's like there's a negative impact on you if you believe in it. In other words, I'm going to have to accept higher utility bills, you know, that sort of thing. Or I'm going to have to stop traveling, you understand what I'm saying? Now, I'm seeing in California they have this terrible drought, and they believe in climate change there. In Ohio, we're not affected that negatively. But yeah, I'm sure it depends on the situation, but the comfort zone seems to have some influence on that.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I'm a decision-making psychologist, and so for me, I always think about that kind of in the context of expected utility theory. I have a probability that something's going to happen, and I have the utility or disutility in this case of it happening. And I have to add up together across all the benefits and the costs of something in order to decide which way am I going to go. Am I really not going to take that plane, or am I? And, to me, it's a utility calculation. It's a weighing of the pros and cons that we have to do for each of us to decide as individuals. And I'm not sure I have a whole lot more to say about it other than it's something that, in my view, should be done thoughtfully. It should be done with data, with numbers, if possible. I suspect that information about, like, the cost of flying could be communicated better with more evidence-based kinds of strategies. So that you could understand your choice better, and you could use the information better. So I'm not sure if I'm quite getting at your question.
Well, yeah. See, I guess the thing is, I can stay in my comfort zone. If I start to believe in climate change, and then I see what's happening in California, I'm out of my comfort zone. So I know there's a negative impact.
Yeah, it's a huge emotional and cognitive cost to this, and then other costs accrue if you continue to believe. Yeah, it's also reality.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate it.